What's going on, everybody? You tune into the 48 Laws of Power podcast. My name is Rudy Malumbo.
And I'm John Karp.
Let's get right into this book. This episode, we're going to do Laws 41 and 42. Law 41 is, avoid stepping into a great man's shoes. The judgment is, what happens first always appears better and more original than what comes after. If you succeed a great man or have a famous parent, you will have to accomplish double their achievements to outshine them. Do not get lost in their shadow or stuck in a past not of your own making. Establish your own name and identity by changing course. Slay the overbearing father, disparage his legacy, and gain power by shining in your own way.
All right, cool. And Robert Greene gives us both a transgression and an observance, and I've kind of gone away from reading both of them, but I think in this case I'm going to go ahead and read or go over both of them because we can see how this law is not being followed and what that produces, and then we can see what happens if you do follow this law.
Absolutely.
So the transgression was of Louis XV, who is the son of Louis XIV. We talked about Louis XIV before. He was what a lot of people called back then the Sun King.
The Sun King. Yeah.
And we've mentioned about how he organized his court so that essentially he was always the center of attention. He actually even moved the palace from Paris to Versailles. That's how Versailles came about.
Absolutely.
And you'd think, oh, well, his son will just pick up from where he left off. Not at all. So what had happened, now his intention, of course, was for that to happen, but not his son, rather, his grandson.
Okay.
In any case, his intention was that his grandson would be, sort of reared into the kingship, if you will.
Yeah.
And that was the whole plan. So when Louis XIV died, Louis XV, who was 5 at the time, was, being trained in, statesmanship and all that sort of thing. But when he finally turned 18, he kind of just threw all that out the door and just turned his attention strictly to pleasures of the flesh, if you will, gambling and drinking and getting it on with the ladies and all that. And really had no interest in governing at all. He kind of just a typical spoiled brat, had everything, all the money and all that.
Get everything handed to him.
Basically. And honestly, quite a lot of the a lot of the government was carried out by some of the mistresses he had. And it came to quite a shock when one of the mistresses let go one of one of his key members of his cabinet, if you will, and that came as a shock to everyone across Europe. And well, no surprise here, Louis XV quickly became disliked by the people of France because he and the members of his court were spending a ridiculous amount of money on just pleasuring themselves, and meanwhile they were racking up France's debt. The price of bread was going up exponentially to the point where the common French person could not afford to buy just basic necessities like bread.
Yeah.
And, so he quickly lost the favor of the French people. And his hope, and when he died, by the way, later on in his life, and I mean very late, like close to his death, he was trying to revert all this. He was trying to become a strong ruler, but at that point it was too late.
He already lost people's
faith and all that, and also his court had just gone completely out of control, just very wild.
After me, the flood is what he used to say, and what members of his court would say.
Yes,
more or less. Everything after me, we don't care what happens.
Well, yeah, and he started to care what happened when he got really sick.
Yeah.
But at that point, it was too late. And his grandson, who became Louis XVI, initially tried to fix the problems that his grandfather had basically set up for him. But Louis the XVI was not an effective ruler, very easy to push over, and he eventually just kind of fell back into the same pattern as his grandfather. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Well, actually, the debts from from France helping out the American Revolution was really the straw that broke the camel's back, because that just sent the debt into way out of control. and eventually Louis the 16th succumbed to the French Revolution and met the guillotine.
100%.
So basically, the moral of that story is you can't. You can't be like Louis the 15th and just assume that just because you were born into a high position that you're going to just have that position forever, or that it's going to last beyond you. Because unless you maintain it, or unless you take the position that you were born into and strike out on a new path, or what have you, or a position is handed to you, unless you take it to a new direction, it's going to shrivel up and die, so to speak.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the one of the things I got from this transgression is when Robert Greene talks about necessity is what impels men to take action, and once the necessity is gone, only rot and decay are left. It kind of illustrates when you think of how Louis XIV was brought up and how Louis XV was brought up. 14 kind of grew up in a situation where he had to take action. He essentially, I don't know a lot about his background, but he essentially came from, nothing or not as much.
No, he's royalty. But what was going on was there was basically a revolution. There was a civil war, rather, in France.
Yeah.
There was a civil war going on in France during his youth, and that it was a long civil war, and it really destabilized the country. It really tormented his predecessors.
Okay.
And so when he came into power, he saw to it that that war be put to an end.
Okay.
And he established himself to be a strong ruler so that the country wouldn't disintegrate into chaos like it had during that civil war.
Okay.
So that's
he was kind of in a position where he had to act in order to I guess to get to that, because if he did nothing,
France would have broken apart. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. So
that was the cruxes of his his steadfastness, if you will.
Okay, definitely. And that was kind of the obstacle he had to face, and so he constantly had to kind of work on that, and in a way kind of forge himself off of that. He saw that opportunity, and he kind of struck out and acted on it. Now with Louis XV, he was in a position where he grew up, and he kind of had everything that he needed. So he kind of had a different kind of mentality with it, where he was like, I have some there's not a lot of necessity here. And so there wasn't much that impelled him forward. So he just kind of rested in the comforts of what was there, and that's kind of what happened there. So he had nothing. He had no kind of I guess stimulus to really do anything. And I feel and Greene kind of talked about how generally like a parent versus a child, like a parent who had to work for everything they had and they ended up being very successful. Now, if you're trying to teach your child, hey, you have to do things this way and that way, A, B, C, and D, whatever, the child can't really, or the person who's under you can't really understand things the way you understand things, because that's not how their world is. Mm-hmm. So I kind of feel like this, that's kind of what this story illustrates. It's a situation where there are two different people that came up in different situations, and one person had to act, and so that forged him and kind of made him a better person, and the other person didn't have to. And so because of that, when you're in a situation where you don't have to do something, why even go through the struggle of forging yourself when there's no need to?
Yeah.
And so the result in how they led was obvious.
Well, yeah, there seems to be a big difference between, for example, people who are born into wealth and people who had to make their own wealth. A lot of times what happens is when people are born into wealth, they end up squandering it.
Exactly.
And either them or their next of kin is back to square one.
Exactly.
They don't appreciate their predecessor, who worked their tail off to acquire all this wealth.
Absolutely. And it's something that we talked about in I think it was Law 40, the free meal, detesting a free meal, where really everything that is worth getting is worth the work. When you get something without doing the work, it's meaningless to you. You kind of understand the gravity of it if you've done the work and you've worked towards it.
Yeah, exactly. And also, like, nothing motivates you to work your butt off than if you have to.
Exactly.
That's like motivation right there. It's a
Absolutely.
do or die is a great motivation.
Yeah, definitely. No one wants to die.
No. But having said that, though, it is possible for someone who was born into a position of privilege, shall we say, to take that position of privilege and grow beyond it, but take it into their own direction. And that's kind of what the observance is about.
Absolutely.
And this is about Alexander the Great. And I'm sure pretty much everybody knows who Alexander the Great is, but they may not know, unless you're a big student of history, you may not know Philip II. And Philip II is not anybody to sneeze at. Philip II, the king of Macedonia, was the one that had united, basically conquered all of Greece and united into one country. Yeah. And bear in mind that before this, Greece was broken up into a bunch of city-states, right? So Athens, Sparta, Argos, all them. So here comes Philip II from Macedonia, which was considered just barbarian land. To the Greeks. They even considered them Greek, even though technically they are. But that's getting into we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But the point is that Philip II and the Macedonians conquered all Greece and unified into one, country.
Yeah.
And you'd think, oh, okay, well, based on the previous story, you'd think, oh, well, his son Alex would just, kind of just live off the fruits of his dad. Not at all. Alexander was very keen on separating himself from his dad as much as possible, to the point where he even adopted completely different behaviors. His father was known for being very keen on the drink and
the women.
And Alexander was not as much of a... He did drink. So and he did like his women and men. He was bisexual.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. And but not to the extent that his father was. I mean, the drinking and the sex.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, so he was a lot more controlled in that matter. He wasn't as much of a party animal, so to speak. Also, too, while his father favored, sort of a calm approach to basically war and strategy and all that, Alexander developed the personality of being kind of brash and being aggressive.
Yeah.
And there were several other things that Alexander did to distinguish himself from his father. And him and his father, to say they didn't get along would be an understatement. They fought a lot.
Yeah.
In fact, to the point where some people suspect that Alexander may have been involved in his assassination, possibly, but that's kind of conspiracy theory stuff. But in any case, one of the stories that kind of puts everything into context here is Philip II had purchased this horse from this merchant. The horse's name was Bucephalus. And
I think we heard about Bucephalus in the law too, I believe, right?
Did we?
About the yeah.
About what?
There was the guy who he worked in the stables, and there was like a wild horse called Bucephalus.
No, this
Michael?
is Michael. Not him.
I could have sworn the horse had the same name.
Did he?
Yeah.
You know what?
But maybe they named a lot of horses Bucephalus, so that's kind of beside the point. Maybe those are famous horses.
I don't want to take the time to look back and see if that was the case. Yeah. I do know that. I knew who the horse Bucephalus was because later on that horse became really famous.
Oh, wow.
Because
he was Alexander the Great's horse.
Yeah, that's what Alexander the Great rode to all the way to India when he eventually conquered that. But we're getting way ahead. Point is that Philip II bought Bucephalus from this merchant, and none of Philip's stablemen could even touch the horse to put a saddle on it, much less tame it. Yeah. This horse is just going out of control. And so Alexander goes, well, I can do it. And Philip was like, all right, go for it, dude. Mm-hmm. And Philip was thinking, okay, this will teach my son a lesson about being, so headstrong and thinking he's better than everyone.
Cocky.
Yeah, and cocky.
Yeah.
Well, sure enough, Alexander got onto Bucephalus and tamed it.
Yep.
And that became his horse that, like I said, he took on all his campaigns all the way to India. And now that I'm thinking about it, that who you're referring to, the horse there, it's not the same horse.
Yeah, I take it he's not.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking maybe he had a backstory. You know what I mean? He threw,
he has there's some crazy backstory with this one horse.
Yeah.
Who he just lived forever.
Yeah. Throughout different, generations.
Like he took Washington in the battle and.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a different horse.
Yeah, it's a completely different horse. But in any case, so there's an example there of someone who, like I said, was born into privilege, born into a high position, but forged their own path
100%.
instead. 100%. And, that's definitely something you can do. In fact, Robert Greene says that if you are born into privilege, you don't turn away an inheritance. That'd be stupid.
Yeah.
Take advantage of the position you're in.
Yeah.
But forge your own path with it.
Exactly.
Because that's the only way. Well, number one, you're going to distinguish yourself from your predecessor and not get lost in their shadow. But it's also the best way to grow whatever endeavor it is that you're mixed up in. So in the case of Alexander, his father had conquered all of Greece, but his father had really wanted to conquer Persia.
Yep.
And his father died before he could do that. So Alexander did that, but that wasn't enough because to Alexander it was like, well, that was my father's vision. I want to go beyond that. And so
100%.
he started going into India.
Yeah. And so one thing I really liked about what Alexander the Great did is he essentially he saw what his dad's weaknesses were. Like he even mentioned that the drinking, and he said the whoring and everything like that was something where like some of his weaknesses. So and he chastised him about it. I think one time when they had one of their little fights.
When his dad was drunk.
Yeah, his dad was drunk. He fell over. He was like, "Oh, this is the man that who conquered all these lands or whatever. He's the guy who he can't even go back and forth from table to table."
Yeah.
You can kind of tell he maybe had some. He kind of resented him for that or something like that. So he also had that vision where when I'm at his level, I'm not gonna be I'm gonna have some of his strengths, but I'm also gonna not have the same weaknesses he has.
Yeah.
Like you mentioned, he was a drinker and all that stuff, but you could tell it was a lot more kind of tempered, and it wasn't something that kind of ran his life. It was something that he did from time to time, but he kind of had it under control. So the one thing Greene kind of talks about is you kind of finding little pockets of vacuum, I guess. So if forging your own identity in ways where you might do the same things maybe your predecessor did, but you also find an angle maybe they didn't do, and you get really good at that, and so you're able to forge your identity in that way, be unique and stand out in that way, while still having all the strengths that your predecessor had also. But Greene also talks about how Alexander the Great's case was a very kind of uncommon thing, and it's not something you see a lot, where someone he followed a very powerful person, but he ended up being even more powerful. So that's obviously in really stark contrast to what Louis XV did, where they both had the same spoils, the same the same kind of benefits and things like that. But Alexander the Great wanted to exceed his father, and Louis XV was just happy with just enjoying what he had.
Yeah, I think the way to kind of follow more of Alexander's example as opposed to Louis XV is to, if you're in a position where you do have a lot, you have to kind of psychologically put yourself in a position where you don't, right? Yeah. And because obviously you do in reality, but you can psychologically deprive yourself in a way, and that will motivate you to push beyond your current station, which is already in a high place.
Yeah.
And another thing you can do is, we've talked about this. I think we talked about this last week, if I'm not mistaken. Create your own symbolism and style that's just distinctly associated with you, right?
Yeah.
So Louis XIV they called him the Sun King, right? And if you were Louis XV, maybe you don't want to be the Sun King, but maybe you can be something that's maybe something directly opposed to it, the Moon King.
Yeah.
Or something. I don't know what that would mean, but you could make some kind of meaning behind it.
Absolutely.
So, and there's a big misconception out there that whatever worked before you will work again.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is that very seldomly, well, not seldomly, but a lot of times the conditions that made something work the first time around don't repeat themselves.
Yeah, that's
right.
changed.
So, granted, it's good to follow certain key things, right? So, like, here's a good example: don't invade Russia.
Yeah.
Right. So, it didn't work for Napoleon. It didn't work for Hitler. It's not going to work for you.
Yeah.
Right. But at the same time, there was a group of people who did invade Russia, and that were the Mongols, and they were successful at it. However, the conditions were completely different, right?
Yeah.
Because when the Mongols invaded Russia, well, Russia was very disorganized. There were a lot of infighting, and it was a lot smaller. It didn't go past the Ural Mountains by this point. When Napoleon and Hitler tried invading Russia, Russia was way more organized and was much larger.
Yeah.
So the conditions had changed.
They're huge.
Yeah. So, you could have told Napoleon, yeah, you can totally invade Russia. The Mongols did it.
Yeah.
And just because they did it doesn't mean that you're going to be successful at it. The conditions are completely different.
Absolutely. And that's something Green kind of touched on too, where he essentially said that kind of plan is kind of like the lazy man's plan. When you just copy and paste, oh, this person did this thing and it worked. So if I replicate it exactly, it'll work. And that's not really a path to power. And it's not necessarily something that you have to take into account a lot of different conditions that change all the time. And for you to just try to copy and paste the same, your predecessors' strategies is kind of. It's not really a good tactic. But he another thing that he kind of mentioned was about how typically when you're trying to escape the shadow of the person in front of you, it's good to kind of belittle their legacy, I guess, in a way, or the same way. 2 previous laws ago, we talked about how the things that you don't want, you have to kind of belittle it or to show disdain towards it. If you're trying to kind of set up a new way and kind of be more unique and stand out from people who were powerful before you, but kind of set up a thing where it's old versus new, and you kind of talk about how the new is better and like the new younger version of this leader is better, and their old legacy, in the past the old legacy did this, did that, and we're much better and more improved. I feel like that's something we tend to see. I think, every single time there's a new president, there's always kind of a poo-pooing of what the person before me did, no matter how great or not great they might have been. We see it in pop culture a lot. I listen to a lot of like hip hop and things like that, and that genre of music has changed a lot over the years. And so now you kind of have a faction with the new kind of young rappers who rap in a different way and whose values are kind of in a different realm, I guess. And the people in the past, they rapped a different way and they kind of valued other things. And there's constantly that battle. But all the young rappers, no matter how successful the older rappers were, they double down and essentially just say, oh, we're better and improved. Who wants to listen to you old guys anyways? They kind of make fun of them. They belittle them. And really it gets a lot of people on their side, and it makes, kind of attracts more power to them because they seem more relevant. And so I think that's it's a pretty efficient way to kind of get out of somebody's shoes in a way, or get kind of exceed people before you.
Yeah, well, that's a tactic you definitely can use, and that's probably why in this country anyway we seem to always go. Most of the time, we seem to go from 8 years Republican, 8 years Democrat.
Yeah,
we go back and forth. We don't, not since well, definitely not in the modern political era, but not since the 1950s. We haven't had like a long stretch of Republicans or a long stretch of Democrats. It's always been.
It was 12 years from 80 to 92, right? With George H.W. and Reagan.
Yeah, but even that's pretty minimal though.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, that's, and also too, that's kind of it's unusual too. You know, I mean, it's like, well, you're always going to have an outlier.
Yeah. But
You know.
yeah, generally it goes 8 years. 8 years one way, 8 years the other way.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
And it's been going on for a very long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's another thing too. If you do achieve success, be careful that you don't become too comfortable in your success. We've mentioned that before, but particularly stagnant in your success, right? So you're kind of constantly wanting to recreate yourself, challenge yourself, right?
Yeah.
I think what makes like you were just talking about music. I think what made Radiohead really successful was they started off as grunge,
Yeah.
but their next album was the Bends.
The Bends, yeah.
You know, it didn't quite have that grunge sound. Had a little bit of a different sound.
Yeah, it was a little bit more kind of coffee house rock kind of.
Yeah, college rock kind of thing. Yeah. And you think, okay, well, they just changed the sound, but they kept doing it. Like, and then eventually,
OK Computer. Was
OK Computer, and then Kid A was almost electronica in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I mean,
they switched it up every single time for or at least up to that point, up to Kid A.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then now this kind of a conglomeration of a lot of different things. But point being is that, you know, that achieves them a lot of success because it's like, well, what are they going to sound like now?
Yeah.
You know, it's way more effective than being like, one of these bands that every single album they've ever put out sounds the same.
Sounds like the same, yeah. It shows lack of growth also. I kind of think like typically for anyone, you tend to kind of be a little bit more satisfied with things the more you evolve. You know what I mean? Whether that's artistically or just personally. So generally when you get to a point where you're not creating anything new or you're not evolving as a person, it definitely kind of, one, I would assume it takes kind of away from your power because people sense that there's not a lot of people don't ever second guess you. They always know what direction you're going to go, and you're constantly stay in one place. So I think your evolution as a person, whether that's creatively or any other way, is very important when it comes to power.
Yeah, and this is applicable to business too, because if you don't constantly innovate and try to change things up, your competition will, and they'll overshadow you. So it's basically the idea is you don't ever want to be in a point where you're too comfortable. You know,
yeah,
it's nice to be comfortable, but don't be too comfortable because that can spell your end.
Absolutely.
In your endeavors. So.
Definitely.
With that said, reversal time? Yeah,
let's go right into the reversal. First of all, I guess before we get into it, I have I liked law number 7, which talks about taking credit, either don't let people take credit for the work you do and take the credit for the work other people do. Towards the end of that law, Green talked a lot about history, about how a lot of the work in any field or in anywhere else has already been done for you. All you have to do is go out, do the research, and use that. I kind of feel like history is very important because history, you learn a lot of lessons from history. People try to do certain things a certain way, and if you have a kind of a wide lens, you can kind of see, okay, these kind of moves are bad to do, and like these patterns, certain patterns show you certain things. So I feel like it's very important. That's kind of what the reversal kind of goes into a little bit. The first part of it just talks about how the past has elements worth appropriating, qualities that would be foolish to reject out of a need to distinguish yourself. So I think it's very important then to look at some of the things that people have done and to kind of appropriate it and incorporate it in your strategy. But on top of that, so it's kind of a mixture of kind of what Law 7 is talking about, where it's good to use history, but also try to, again, kind of find the grooves in there, kind of find different voids that aren't being filled, and then to go in and to go on from there. So you just kind of take from the past and you improve. And that's kind of what the first part of this is. He also talks about if you have the kind of intelligence and instinct that will point you in the right direction, playing the rebel will not be dangerous. But if you're mediocre, as Joseph II he was talking about Joseph II and his predecessor was a very powerful woman. It's in comparison to his mother, you're better off learning from your predecessor's knowledge and experience, which are based off of something real. It's if you are gonna play like someone, if you're gonna set yourself as a part of someone who's a rebel and things like that, it has to be a little bit more calculated. You have to kind of have a plan to formulate that, as opposed to just being that's your thing. You can't really do things without thinking. It has to be a little more calculated. That was the thing there. The last point in the reversal that he talks about is to watch the young, because when you think about it, very kind of the kinds of people that want to make a name of themselves, who might follow a powerful person, will always try to find ways to, one, bring the person who goes before them down in the future, and also to kind of find the same thing we're talking about before, who kind of use the past and kind of find the grooves in there. So a good way, if you are a powerful person and there is someone ahead of you, try to keep your eye on them and kind of see where they're headed, and kind of don't let them really kind of get the upper hand on you. Watch their moves, study their moves, and kind of fight against it, and that kind of prolongs your power as well. That's essentially what I got from the reversal.
Okay, yeah. A couple of things there. The idea that you can learn from history is totally true.
Yeah.
It's kind of the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly.
But, like I said, you kind of want to take the lessons from the past and grow from them, knock off some of the things that aren't applicable anymore, or didn't work, or didn't even work then, and add something else onto it that will be more applicable or may work better. So there's that, but principally the one that I wanted to talk about was the idea of watching out for the young. Like, I get it in one sense, keep an eye on them, because one day they're going to come of age, and you're going to be on your way out.
Yeah, replace you pretty much. Yeah.
Pretty much, and that's just a natural cycle, and so don't be afraid of that necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of stories of people trying to subvert the young and hold on to what the power that they have, but the fact of the matter is they can't live forever, and it's inevitable that the young are going to replace you.
Yeah, definitely.
So rather than constantly being at battle with the youth, I would say instead bring the youth in and kind of groom them to take your place in the future. Mm-hmm. Louis XIV tried having that done with his grandson, and it didn't work out. And I think in a lot of cases, people try to do that and it doesn't work out. But, in a lot of other cases people do, and it does work out. And it's better to try than to not, I would say.
Yeah.
And I think what ends up happening more often than not is someone who will start a company will have one vision of the company, right? And then several generations down the line, whoever the next CEO is, how they're running the company is completely divorced from the idea that originally started the company, right? And that's kind of a problem, because, what at one time where the company promised security and honesty, courtesy. There's one company I'm thinking of in particular, but I don't know if I can name them. Where one company promises courtesy, and then several generations down the line, the CEO is encouraging people to partake in unethical business practices so they can make more money.
Yeah.
Now there's a divorce between how the company started and where it is now, and it's not a good divorce. That's something that could easily put that company out of business.
Exactly.
So it's one of those things where you kind of want to prepare the person who's going to inevitably take your place to take your place in a way that you would see most fit. Understanding that, of course, they're going to have to change some things and make it their own, and be okay with that. Yeah. And that can be a hard thing to do, because if you started something, or if you inherited something for that matter and made it your own, now it's kind of your baby. But you have to understand that it's necessary for those changes to occur.
Yeah.
But you can rein in on some of those changes and say, no, you don't want to do that, because if you do that, this and this will happen, and you don't want that to happen because it's going to bite you in the butt later on.
Yeah.
Or, in this one company I'm thinking of, you should not do that because it's unethical, and it's going to make it's going to put that name on the business, and eventually it's going to catch up to us, and we'll go out of business because no one's going to want to do business with someone who has unethical practices.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where, sort of like it's kind of like I half agree with the reversal.
Yeah.
Or at least that aspect of a reversal, but I half disagree with it. And I think maybe the view I'm putting upon it might be a little bit more nuanced.
Yeah.
Perhaps maybe a little overly nuanced.
Well, I think it's I think the reversal that he has kind of fits the tone of the book a little bit. I think there's some parts of this book where he talks a lot about kind of being kind of hoarding power and being very kind of selfish with it, and sometimes trying to fight as much as you can to keep it. And I don't think that's a natural kind of thing. I think it makes more sense, kind of having like a wider lens view of it, where it's like you look at power as quote unquote power as something that kind of comes and goes and ebbs and flows and things like that. So when you're on top, that's not going to last. It's impermanent and things like that. So then you just kind of have to accept it when that reaches the end, and then kind of help parlay the next person by maybe tutoring them, or and seeing the people who kind of are have the potential to kind of reach the caliber that you're at right now, and just get the process going that way. So I totally agree with what you're saying. I just kind of feel like the tone of the book is kind of, some parts of the book have a tone kind of like this, and I feel like that's mostly why it's in there.
No, I get it. I just thought I'd add that little tidbit.
Yeah, definitely. Let's move right along to law number 42, which is strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. The judgment is, trouble can often be traced to a single, strong individual, the stirrer, the arrogant underling, the poisoner of goodwill. If you allow such people room to operate, others will succumb to their influence. Do not wait for the troubles they cause to multiply. Do not try to negotiate with them. They are irredeemable. Neutralize their influence by isolating or banishing them. Strike at the source of the trouble, and the sheep will scatter.
Okay, Robert Greene gave 2 observances. Both of them are great, but the one that I think really kind of gets to the meat of the matter is the one about Pope Boniface VIII. And so what had occurred was Pope Boniface came into power as a pope, and he really wanted to extend the power of the papal states. And the papal state, this is during in Italian history, where the Italian peninsula was broken up into several different, micronations, if you will. Well, not micronations, but smaller entities, if you will.
City-states, I guess?
No, not city-states. They were a little bit bigger than city-states. They were like just tiny little independent states, right? But in any case, in the papal states where was a small area that was completely under the control of the Catholic Church, okay?
Okay.
So Pope Boniface wanted to extend the power of the papal states, and his big target was Florence. And Florence was very much opposed to being under the papal states because they were a republic, and they didn't really like the idea of being under having everything told. They didn't like the idea of being told to do everything according to what the Pope said necessarily. Okay. Even though they were Catholic, you were like, well, we want to govern ourselves.
Yeah,
essentially.
Okay.
Now, at the time in Florence here, there was a big divide between 2 groups of people, and they were the blacks and the whites. And I'm not talking about race here. The whites were the individuals who recently acquired wealth, mostly through mercantilism.
Okay.
And the blacks were basically old money.
Okay. Old money, new money.
Yes, it's kind of old money, new money thing. Now, at this time, the whites had completely taken control of Florence, and much to the chagrin of the blacks, and they're I know it's hard to separate the thing, I know, but in any case, and the big spokesman for the whites was Dante Alighieri, I think is how you say it.
Yeah.
Alighieri.
I always say Alighieri. I'm sure it's wrong.
I think it's Alighieri, but in any case, the guy who wrote the Inferno.
Dante's Inferno.
The Divine Comedy, all that. Same guy.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Dante was the whites' big spokesman, and Pope Boniface knew this, and so he also knew that if he really wanted to see that the blacks take back power in Florence, then eventually Boniface can have his way and extend his influence and eventually bring Florence into the fold of the Papal States. Okay. He knew that the best way to do that was to remove Dante because he was the whites' most ardent spokesman, right? Mm-hmm. So he concocted this plan that involved the King of France's brother, what was his name? Oh, Charles de Vaux, I think is how you say it. And with Charles de Vaux, the Pope was marching his army towards Florence, and Florence decided to send Dante and a bunch of other delegates to meet with this force and try to negotiate something. And Boniface agreed to basically halt the offensive, but he wanted to have one of the delegates go back with him to Rome to further talk the negotiations. And he chose Dante, and Dante agreed to this, so Dante went to Rome. And while Boniface and Dante were, talking negotiations in Rome, Charles de Valois, he was taking the money that Boniface had given him to basically bribe members of the whites and to basically sow dissension amongst the whites among themselves, and basically this created a lot of infighting among the whites, and the blacks saw their opportunity and usurped the whites' power violently. Yeah. And once that occurred, then Boniface allowed Boniface ended his meeting with Dante, but at that point Dante was not allowed to come back to Florence, or he would be burnt at the stake. Yep,
he had a weakened power base,
because the people who had supported him were no longer in power, and the people who opposed him were. Yep. So Dante was never able to return to Florence for the rest of his life, and Boniface was able to use the blacks that he had basically helped put in power to extend his power, and eventually Florence was swallowed up by the Papal States.
100%. The interpretation just talks about how, the main lesson in this observance and really what the previous observance too is just, whenever there's an enemy, whenever there's a common enemy, it's actually a lot more advantageous to instead of facing all the different sides of the enemies, to find one source of it, the main kind of troublemaker, the main person that's really in control of everything. If you can, in a way, kind of manipulate that source, manipulate that person or whatever it is, and if you can change that, or you can separate the person from the situation, then that does a lot of the work for you. You don't necessarily have to go and combat everyone else. You take the shepherd out, or the leader, the stirrer, and then everyone else kind of falls in place. Or if they don't, then at least it'll be a much easier victory, as it was here with Dante.
Well, yeah, there's two key things. You can either take out the leader, or you can isolate them. And taking out the leader is that's a more brutal way to do it. Yeah. It's common in battle, particularly in medieval times. Oftentimes when the king or whatever was taken out in battle, that would cause chaos among the troops because they didn't have their rallying figure, and they could be easily defeated by the enemy. And that remains true to an extent today in the military, but it's kind of in your day-to-day life. It may not be the most prudent tactic.
Yeah.
Rather, you want to be a little bit more discreet about it, and the best way to do that is through isolation.
Yeah.
So, if you're in a situation where you're actively competing against someone, say in business, the best thing to do would be to, kind of like what Boniface did, find a way to sow dissension among that your competitor's power base, their followers or workers or whatever, and have them turn against their leader, so to speak, and or leave their leader or what have you, and either the leader will become overwhelmed by all of a sudden all his former supporters being against him, or if his supporters just abandon him, then he'll just basically fade away. Go somewhere else. He'll go away, basically.
Absolutely. The Green even talked about how this is something that's sometimes used in family therapy, where you have a family or whatever, and there's constantly a lot of issues there. If what they try to do is they try to notice the person that's kind of agitating them the most, and they kind of separate them a little bit, maybe just a few feet away from where everyone else is sitting, and people kind of naturally pick up on that. They kind of notice, this is the person that's kind of causing us the most trouble, and when people pick up on it, then it's usually a lot easier for them to kind of to see that, and then to react to that and say, okay, this is the person that's doing it, so they're kind of able to deal with it a little bit better. But it's something that most people could be blind to. But I think that it's also I think you see it everywhere. I think if you're just in tune with the patterns and things like that, and you're in a less than desirable situation, you can always pinpoint, if it's not a person, maybe it's a thing, maybe there's some kind of outside element that's causing all the trouble, but it's usually one direct source. And I think it's very important to kind of be in tune with that and to notice that.
Well, yeah, I definitely think the way to use this law, as we always talk about, the moralistic way to use this law, which is the way that we promote, would be to use it on those who are causing problems, not just simply to exert your will.
Yeah, and just to get rid of people.
And just to get rid of people, basically.
Yeah.
This, it's one of those things that it's twofold. This is something that the individual who's causing the problems, this is what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're sowing dissension among, everyone else.
Yeah.
And trying to basically divide everybody and conquer that way. Well, you can use that on them too, if it's, really that bad. I mean, it's definitely something that Stalin did when when the USSR invaded the Caucasus. He intentionally separated the Azerbaijanis from the Armenians. And even today, you can see the result of that. If you look at the borders of Azerbaijan and Armenia, you'll notice that there's a chunk of Azerbaijan broken off from the rest of Azerbaijan, and it's separated by Armenia, and then there's Armenians who are living in Azerbaijan, right? And so there's what's the name of that disputed region, Norbakorg Republic or something like that.
This is way, yeah.
I can't pronounce it correctly, but the point is that
that's outside my pay range.
Point is that that's right, because you only French. Anyway, point is that Stalin did that so that these the various people in the Caucasus, in this case the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis, wouldn't rise up against the USSR, right, and cause issues for the USSR. Well, imagine if if the various Soviets and the various people who had fallen under the sway of the USSR had used the same tactic against Stalin and the USSR.
Yeah.
It would have been a completely different. Well, history would be a lot different, that's for sure.
Definitely.
So it's one of those things to bear in mind that if someone's trying to usurp, the status quo, or just trying to, take power for themselves. Let's put it that way, because sometimes you have to upset the status quo.
Yeah.
But let's just say that someone's trying to take power for themselves. They're using this tactic, so it would behoove you to use this tactic against them anyway. Yeah. And that's a moralistic way you can do it. Also, like what you said in family therapy, you can use this in family dynamics. Like, okay,
definitely.
Who's really, what's really the cause of all this strife that's going on in our family.
Yep.
You can use this in your own business. There's usually one coworker that might be stirring up dissension among all the other coworkers, and
the bad apple.
Who not only is not getting their work done, but is causing other people to not get their work done.
Exactly.
And that's slowing down your product.
I'm thinking of somebody at where I work right now.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, and that slows down the productivity of the company, and you might want to figure out who that person is and get them out of there as quickly as possible.
Yeah, or maybe even isolate them. See if them not socializing with other people can if they work better that way, they don't kind of infect people with their.
You could try that.
Views,
yeah,
definitely.
Florida's a right to work state, so you could just go ahead and fire them. That's what I would do. Yeah. Why waste time?
There you go. Might as well. Cut the dead weight.
But hey, you know what? Some states and in some countries, it's not right to work. Where they're union and they can do whatever they want so long as they're a member of the union, which is kind of the downside to unions. There's a good side to them, but there is that too. Something to consider. But any case, so if you choose to remember, I said you can be more direct, or you can isolate them, and by far in most cases isolating is the most effective way to go about it. One of the most effective ways to basically use isolation is to find somebody who's in a position of power already, but who has become isolated, which happens a lot when you become successful, because you got to figure there's we call them the 1% for a reason. Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of isolating to be the 1% because you're not of the 99% anymore, right?
That's true.
It's very lonely at the top, they say.
A lot of people in the 99.
Exactly. So it can be very lonely to be at the top, and it's kind of a consequence of the successful that they end up kind of isolating themselves. Now, of course, you can avoid that if you're successful in your industry by maintaining your contacts and goodwill and all that. But it's very easy to become overly isolated anyway. So what you can do is find that person who's already has a position of power, but has in one way or another become isolated.
Yeah.
And kind of take advantage of their standing, and kind of attach yourself to them, and kind of take advantage of their standing and grow your own power, so to speak.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And it's that works out really great, because they've kind of already, you don't have to do the work of isolating them. They've already isolated themselves in a way.
Yeah.
So all you're doing is just swooping in and reaping the benefits.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a Robert Greene mentioned Rasputin. That's what he did, because he was a lowly peasant, and he kind of, he was he was kind of more like a priest, really.
Yeah.
Actually, he was a priest within the Eastern Orthodox.
A very weird guy too.
Well, there's a lot of there was a lot of stories about him, dabbling in the occult, occult rather, not the occult. What am I saying?
Isn't that your eye? The oculus?
The occult.
Yeah.
And actually, it was because he had supposedly healed the Tsar's son.
Okay.
That's why he maintained close ties with the royal family in Russia. Hemophobia was what his son suffered from.
Okay.
And supposedly somehow Rasputin cured it.
Wow.
How true that is really debatable. I mean, the kid was cured of his hemophobia for sure, but exactly how Rasputin did it is very unclear.
Yeah.
But in any case, doesn't really matter, because Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandria were convinced that Rasputin was responsible for their son being healed.
Oh.
So that won him the favor of the royal family of Russia, particularly Tsarina Alexandria, who actually exerted a little bit more power over the Tsar, because she kind of was way more influential over him.
Yeah.
Because Tsar Nicholas was not exactly the, let's just say it was a bit of a pushover.
Oh, okay, yeah. There you go. She wore the pants.
Yeah, so to speak. Yeah. So Rasputin was able to kind of move into where there was already isolation, because who could be more isolated than the czars of, the turn of the century Russia?
Absolutely.
I mean, come on.
Yeah.
so he moved in there and kind of ingratiated himself to, the whole royal family, but really in particular to Tsarina Alexandria.
Yeah.
And so that won him a lot of power and
He was able to
favors.
get power from that,
Yeah.
Even though he was a kind of a lowly, just a guy that wasn't really well known.
Yeah, he started
no
off
power.
just as a regular old peasant boy, became a
Yeah.
priest, and
Yeah.
there you go.
There you go.
So it's
Absolutely.
one of those things.
Definitely.
And then, of course, well, I mentioned that, so I think we're good.
Let's do this thing. Reversal time. So Green starts it off by quoting Machiavelli. He goes, "Any harm you do to a man should be done in such a way that you need not fear his revenge." Essentially, the reversal to this law is to kind of know who you're dealing with in a way. So for someone who, if you are gonna kind of practice this kind of tactic and isolate somebody, it's better to do it from a superior position. That way, when the person finds out or something happens and it doesn't work out that way, you can't really suffer from their resentment in a way. So essentially, know who you're dealing with and know the repercussions that could come if the situation fails and everything like that. But yeah, that's essentially it.
Well, there's that, and also too mentions that it's often better to keep enemies on your side rather than isolating them. Like, just bring them into your fold, basically.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So like, for example, we talked about a while ago, that one Chinese during the warring states period in China, the general who ended up becoming the emperor. I can't remember his name, but once he had basically taken control, he gave land to the generals who had fought against him, and they were less likely to rebel against the guy because they had got a plot of land that they had of their own, which was different than what had usually happened when someone had conquered China. Is they usually were executed.
Yeah.
So
There's some law too.
Yeah, but yeah. So so by giving them some land, he kind of bought them their loyalty and brought them into his fold, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because that like if China were to have been attacked again, that they were going to jump in and defend this guy in China because they had something to lose too if China were invaded, their land, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that's something to consider.
Definitely. All right. Well, for the 48 Laws of Power podcast, I've been Rudy Malumba.
And I'm John Carp.
Signing off.
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 John Carp.